professor at UC, where I work at the Clearinghouse for Military Family Readiness, which is a social science research institute. And I'm also a part-time assistant professor with the clinical mental health counseling program at Lock Haven University, soon to be known as the Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania. And with me, I have 3 of my students. Ian, if you'd like to introduce yourself first.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Ian McGregor. As you can see after my name, I have a master's in science, which I just achieved only a few days ago. So quite excited about that. But I was at Lock Haven University and just came out to Salt Lake City, Utah to take a job as a primary therapist in a residential program. I'd only got here just a few days ago, so still getting settled. Some of my research interests are obviously military populations. Also, I love wilderness therapy, adventure therapy, experiential therapy, something I'm really passionate about, and it's why I got into this industry in the first place. Self-care, of course, as well. So that's it for me. I think you're up, Rebecca or Michelle.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Aaron. So I'm currently a master's student in the clinical mental health counseling at Lock Haven, where I'm specializing in military veterans and their families. So really looking forward to present some of our findings to you all today. The military is definitely a passion of mine, along with working with college students.
Hi, I'm Michelle Goldstein. I'm also a student at Lock Haven University in clinical mental health counseling program. I'm going into my last year, the internship year, so finished all of the coursework. And I also am very interested. I'm interested in all different fields within counseling, and specifically working with military families and the unique challenges that they go through.
Thanks for having us all here today. So moving on, our presentation is going to explore primary differences between the military and civilian cultures. For some, the military culture may be a new culture that you're exploring with us today. For others, it may be near and dear to your heart. We'll learn a little bit more about who you are and how, if you're connected to the internet in our next slide, but we'll get into the differences in those cultures. We'll also examine the relationships of culture between the individual through the Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, and then we'll understand how to identify and address cultural conflicts when these occur in counseling sessions with military clients through examples. And you will walk away learning at least 3 techniques that you can use for identity, culture, and value exploration with your clients. So who is in our audience? We want to know, are you military connected, and why you are here, what you're hoping to get from our presentation today. So if you want to use the chat or you want to unmic, please feel free to do so. I'm seeing a couple individuals, one U.S. Army veteran, retired Navy. So there's some connection having served. Someone just went to military school. Awesome. We have a college counselor, military wife, whose husband is a combat veteran. Awesome. So some personal connections. Great. Well, thank you to those who have shared. Oh, we have one last one, retired military, possible population of interest. So great. We have a lot of individuals who are connected. It looks like maybe one who is not, which is perfectly fine. We are here to really advocate that despite being military connected, you are able to effectively work with this population as long as you are well aware of the culture. So let's move on here. So just starting with culture, when we think of culture, culture includes shared values, social norms, and worldviews associated with a particular group. It can also mean learned practices of individuals, such as communication patterns and morals in a given group or community. Cultures are dynamic, so they can change over time. As counselors, we really need to be aware of that, and we need to continue to educate ourselves. As counselors, we must learn to also embrace cultural competency, which first means having that knowledge and awareness of ourselves, and then that knowledge and awareness of our client's culture. And as counselors, we must be able to recognize that our clients, they have values and they're coming from a particular viewpoint. And that way we can respond using culturally appropriate assessments and interventions. So this is important when we think about working with someone inside and outside of the military. Rebecca will highlight some key differences between the two. So military versus civilian cultures.
All right, thank you. So as you stated, we're going to talk a little bit about what really is the difference between what you think of as typical American culture versus the US military culture. So for today, we're going to focus on two different areas. So the first will be individualism versus collectivism. And the second one that I'm going to speak about is the emotional expressiveness versus emotional restraint. So starting with individualism versus collectivism, when we think of American culture, a lot of the times we think of the value of the singular person. So what's going to benefit me most? What do I want to do? Whereas in the US military, it's kind of the opposite, where they're really concerned about the group needs. And so in order to do that, they need to think of, the other people in their units, in their unit cohesion, and making sure that the whole unit is really being valued, because if you're only focusing on yourself, that's going to put the other people in the unit or in the greater military at risk. When you're working with firearms and life and death situations, it's really important that everybody is able to, move as one in order to be successful and make sure everybody comes home safe and sound. Another part of functioning under the collectivism is making sure that you follow a chain of command in the military. So you want to make sure that whoever is above you is someone that you're listening to, and then goes up the chain from there. And you're really putting your trust and authority in that person to make kind of all the major decisions. When we're looking at American individualism, we always feel like we know what's best for us. We can make all of our own decisions, where in the military, again, it's your chain of command that's going to make those decisions for you. And that's really positively reinforced every time a mission is completed, people come home safely, that the chain of command is right, and they know what you're doing, and you can put your trust in them. And then finally, a kind of overarching idea for collectivism in the military is the expectation that everybody's going to behave in the same way. So whether they're speaking the same language, whether they're dressing the same, and again, behaving the same. So perhaps there's certain terms in the military that normal civilians would not know, whether it's DD-214 and NCO, MOS, all of those ideas that, you need to understand that language to be able to function in this particular culture. You also have your specific uniforms, whether it's all dressed up, it's your casual or your PT uniform, you're all expected to dress the same way. And again, behaving in the same way. You have to learn to walk a certain way in a certain line, and things like that. So that's kind of the individualism for American culture compared to the collectivism that is valued within the military. And moving on from there, you have the idea of emotional expressiveness versus emotional restraint. So in the US, it's very common for people to talk about their feelings, to act upon their feelings, and to really express those feelings. Whereas in the military, again, it's the opposite, focusing on that emotional restraint. So one reason that people in the military are not as apt to share or express their emotions is the idea that they always need to be combat ready. So if they're being distracted by certain feelings of being scared or feeling guilty or feeling upset, then they're going to be distracted and not be able to complete that mission that they're on. It also causes them to have to numb the hardships of war. So whatever they have personally done, things that they have seen, kind of having that emotional restraint. So again, it's not distracting them from whatever it is for the task that's kind of at hand. And again, that kind of goes along with the traditional masculine characteristics that are really valued in the military. So that's toughness, courage, and personal sacrifice. So whether that's sacrificing your time or your family, or even if it comes down to your life, those are all real expectations of the military culture. And so with that, I will go ahead and pass it along to Michelle to dive a little bit further in.
Before we get there, thanks, Rebecca, for sharing specifics about military culture. Just on this next slide, what we're looking at here is a theoretical framework for conceptualizing human development. So the bioecological system theory. Taking a system's worldview in counseling is important when we want to holistically understand issues in one's life as it relates to relationships between the individual and the interactions within the systems that they belong. So this bioecological signifies this total influence that operates within an individual's life, which changes in degrees of closeness when we're starting with these biologically created characteristics and then expanding them to the larger socio-cultural context that's constructing one's interactions. So this perspective is providing an in-depth understanding into an individual based on their life context. And you can see here that there's differentiation among the individual's life context, and they're commonly represented. So on the slide, you can see these different circles are breaking down the complex processes and relationships that exist. So in this theory, individuals are interacting with 5 different systems. You can see the microsystem, the mesosystem, the ecosystem, the macrosystem, and then the chronosystem. So looking again at the visual, at this individual level, this is where we're seeing demographics, history, biological factors. And the next level, the microsystem level, that's what's encompassing the individual's most immediate environment. So for this level, we're thinking the individual characteristics such as emotional regulation and behavioral. So we're looking at these as interactions with close others that are critical to examine. We've got our mesosystem, which is including progressions between 2 or more microsystems. So people who are actively engaged with the individual in different settings. And then cross settings as well. So we're really looking at the individual's life of microsystems, including the ability to be in the community in which the individual lives, the work setting, the interaction with family and friends. And then the ecosystem level is a system that's encompassing broader elements, the individual's environment. We're looking at progressions between 2 or more subsystems, but here at least one of them does not directly contain the person. So the individual has less control over circumstances in life and the larger social system forces of influence. So when we think of like social services. And then the macro system level, it's wider societal factors. So culture, policies, dominant beliefs and worldviews of the society are considered here at this level. So these cultural influences, which may change an individual's well-being, as it could lead to, when we're thinking of some inequities that we're seeing, so gender inequities within norms and regulations, for example. And then for this presentation, the macro system level is where we're really thinking about military culture, which, as we just learned, differs when compared to other cultures. And then finally, the last level here, we're looking at the individual's lifetime of experiences that are considered as it relates to impact on the current status. And so this framework is helpful when we want to understand issues. So for example, stress or conflict in one's life as it relates to relationships between the individuals, so thinking the client here, and then the interactions within the systems that they belong. So that military culture versus maybe another culture that they're a part of at the individual level. So we'll jump into cultural conflicts on the next slide so you can see how there could be conflicts at various levels in these systems.
So before we, first of all, thank you, Dr. Fee. As we look at these conflicts, before we get into the specific examples, I want to give a little bit of a context of, why this paradox exists. Why isn't the military culture made to be more like its surrounding culture? So the military exists for the purpose of the defending the country. The mission is to win wars. So this involves uncomfortable training and actions that result in death and destruction. And that's done purposefully. So the warrior culture, it purposely desensitizes these individuals to the reality they may face, where if they didn't have this training, this desensitization, then it would be really hard for them to be, as Rebecca said, combat ready to do the mission that they have. So this allows them to accomplish their mission, but it causes a cognitive dissonance because it doesn't fit within the values that they hold dear in their civilian lives. So if Dr. P, if you want to move on to the next slide, take a look at some of these specific conflicts. On one hand, we have the warriors are stoic, that they are numb to their emotions. And if they need help, then that's considered a weakness. But on the other hand, in our culture, the general societal culture, it's okay to seek mental help. It's considered a strength and good if you need mental health treatment, if you recognize your challenges and you seek help for it. So those two values are a conflict with each other. The next one we have is the warrior ethos. Talk a little bit more about what that specific ethos is when we get to that slide. But it's in conflict with a public that these individuals are surrounded with outside of their military lives that's in general peace loving. So the warrior ethos is like fight, win, more of violent nature compared to a peaceful society that they're in when they're not surrounded by their military culture. Third, the combat reality of violence, just when they are at war, when they're surrounded by a violent environment. And that is conflict with if there are individuals who adhere to a religious doctrine, they believe that you do not murder. So how do they reconcile this military mission to kill with their religious values of not harming and murdering other people? That's a conflict that could definitely surface after someone has come back from a combat zone if they held a religious value dear before they went into that environment. Finally, we're going to look at the example in the military environment. As Rebecca mentioned, the chain of command. You're expected to put the military first. You listen to what your superior says and you don't question it. You do it and you put all the needs of the military before everything else. Yet, people might also have a family culture that conflicts with this, where they feel like they want to commit to their family and put their needs first, and the military is their job. And how do they justify sacrificing things that their family might need for something that's their job? And it's hard to look at the military culture as just a job in the context of the family. I see Carrie wrote a comment. Most religions have the concept of there being no greater love than to give your life for another, and that is reiterated in the military as a justification. that is definitely one of the justifications that they give within the military to help people reconcile this conflict that they might face. When we get to that slide for that example, actually, I'll share an interesting example from a few decades ago. So let's get into the first cultural conflict, the warrior stoicism of the unemotional compared to seeking mental health treatment. So the warrior stoicism is actually a very ancient military mindset. Basically, in summary, it's you learn in training, you just suck it up. You get through, you don't let yourself be sad or distraught. You just do what you need to do. It actually goes back to ancient Greek philosophy. There's a story of the senior naval pilot who was a prisoner of war during Vietnam. His name was Admiral Stockdale. He was the senior officer that was a prisoner of war. So he was tortured mercilessly for 7.5 years. And when he got released, he credited Epictetus, I think that's how you pronounce it. He was the Greek philosopher who wrote about the Stoic philosophy as the way to win wars. And he had studied this philosophy. And after he finally was released and got home, he said he credited that mentality for his survival and for being able to make it through that much time as a prisoner of war. So there is something to be said for that suck it up ancient Stoic mindset. But in contrast, the DoD and the Department of Veteran Affairs see a need for mental health treatment for people to be able to recognize their emotions and their mental health challenges and to see that it's okay to need help and to get help. So they're making significant efforts right now and they have been for a few decades. It's a process, but they've been embarking on it to try to fight this mental health stigma. Why it's needed. There's an estimated 25% of military personnel have a mental health problem. I hesitated to write diagnosis because many have not necessarily been diagnosed, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And if they sought help, that it would get diagnosed. There has been a tragic increase in suicide rates. And they recognize that there needs to be a shift in the individual and the warrior culture. Instead of seeing mental health as a weakness, as a medical problem, they need to see it as competence and strength, that it's a good thing and it's a sign of strength and like power to recognize what you need and to seek that help, that it's promoting your own resilience and your health rather than seen as a weakness. So the program that they've started to try to quote unquote market this mental health aid in a culturally competent way is called Def Ed, or Defender's Edge program. So they've made a lot of progress, and they're still trying to find ways to help market mental health aid and make it seen as acceptable and almost praiseworthy if people need it to get the help that they need. So our next example, looking at the warrior ethos. So this goes a little bit into what Rebecca was talking about. What is the warrior ethos? So it's those internalized standards of behavior of how to live as a military member, and if necessary, die by those standards. They have the role of being a protector, being a defender. They need, when they're in a position where they need to use force, it needs to be done without any hesitation. So like that instinctive, not thinking, just doing what you've been trained to do. The strengths in the warrior ethos, it's seen as a strength if you're aggressive, if you have combat success, if you're innovative adaptability, if you have a good team attitude, not individualist, as Rebecca described in the military culture, you're supposed to be a collectivist, part of the team. You're not supposed to think of yourself as an individual. In this mentality, it's seen as a weakness if you have failure, if you focus on your ego and arrogance. Now, this can contrast greatly with the culture of a peace-loving public. Pacifism is seen as the opposite end of the moral spectrum from a warrior mentality. Recently, especially with social media, public opinion becomes very well known. Public opinion can affect public policy. It has a strong and loud voice in our society. So if someone is trained in the warrior mentality, it can feel very, it can give them a lot of just this internal dissonance to be surrounded when they're home with a more pacifist or anti-military mindset, if that's what they end up encountering. In addition to social media, there have been different times throughout the last few decades when there is a war that the public is against. There are protests. There sometimes are riots, or there's strong opinions on the media. So it really surrounds them. They can't escape that mentality that goes against the warrior ethos. Because it's not always reputable reporting, these opinions can at times be inadequately informed. They might not always be based in truth. I hesitate to use the word truth. Opinions are opinions. So they're not necessarily factual. So for our third example, we have the example of the combat violence. If people need to injure or to the extreme commit murder, compared to the religious doctrine, thou shalt not kill. So the military often requires the personnel to commit acts of violence in the context of armed conflict, as we discussed. They're trained to believe, as was mentioned in the chat, that this violence is acceptable and right because it was stated so eloquently by Carrie that it's a statement of love if, sorry, I'm rereading it. It was so interesting how you explained it. Yeah, to risk your life or to kill another in trying to show love for protecting your country, then that's the justification that it's okay to be violent in this environment. So there definitely is justification for why this could be a mentality. And like I explained, they're trained to act without hesitating, just violent in if they feel they need to defend themselves, defend their comrades, etc. Yet there are those conscientious objectors who feel that it's very not okay according to their religion. There's a really interesting example, Desmond Doss. They actually made a documentary about him and then later a movie about him called Hacksaw Ridge. He was a Seventh-day Adventist who was fixated on the sixth commandment. Never in any circumstances did he ever want to commit murder. So he was a medic in, trying to remember now, I can't remember if, I believe it was in Vietnam. If I'm wrong, someone please correct me. I have not seen the movie, unfortunately, but I really want to. But he voluntarily enlisted as a medic. He wanted to serve his country. He wanted to help the war effort, but he refused to carry a weapon. At the same time, he saved hundreds of lives out on the battlefield as a medic. World War II. Thank you, Dr. P. So he saved hundreds of lives out on the battlefield as a medic while staying true to what he felt were very important religious principles. So I personally am going to watch that movie soon now that my semester is over. So I suggested to anyone else who like to learn about that also. Now to look at our last example, the conflict of putting the mission first or showing commitment to your family, making the statement that I'm going to prioritize what my family needs. So just a few examples of what it might look like to have that instinct of this mission comes first. For the military member who is on call, for example, needs to go on temporary duty missions or reservist, or is like on call for a deployment. They get that late night phone call saying, we need you. It triggers this overwhelming response to duty that they need me. I need to go do this. Not thinking, oh, but what does my kid need tomorrow? What does my husband or wife need from me? It's they called me, no matter what it takes, I'm going and I'm doing this. And with that sense of duty, there's a pride. It goes with contributing to the mission, being part of the unit, serving with total commitment. And then during those deployments, the personnel compartmentalizes, because if they were thinking every day about, I miss my family, I can't be there for this birthday, I can't be there for this holiday, if they let those thoughts consume them, then it would be incredibly challenging to do the mission that they need to do. So they compartmentalize those thoughts of their family, and they devote all of their concentration to the mission at hand. Yet there still is that other side, that commitment to family. There's a sense of responsibility, responsibility for their spouse, for their children's well-being during their absence. How are they faring? Do they have mental health challenges missing a parent? They want to feel good about their relationships. When they come home, those relationships are going to matter. So are they contributing to these relationships what they need to and trying to make it good? Families make sacrifices, a lot of sacrifices. Military families move all the time. Military families go through deployments, different locations. Hello, goodbye again. Hello, goodbye again. So is the service member supporting them in the sacrifices that they're making? The more support the family gets from the service member, then the more strength and resilience they'll have through all of the challenges that they have to face. So those are the main cultural conflicts that these service members might face in dealing with their warrior mentality and their commitment to the mission and their duty to their country compared to their role in society and their family and all of these other parts that are also part of who they are. So Ian, now you're going to tell us how to help and work with all of these conflicts.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Michelle. So that was a lot of really great information. So now coming to the techniques. So let's take a look. This is one of my favorite subjects in counseling to discuss with my clients, identity, culture, values. So I was really excited to jump on board for this presentation today. Before I jump into activities I use, these 4 boxes for me are extremely important. This is based off my value system, but also what I find to be important in sessions. So I feel that culture, identity, and values can be extremely personal to us. Sometimes people can be ashamed or uncomfortable or not willing to discuss certain parts of that. So this is really important for me, is to first obtain permission or simply ask a client, hey, is it okay if we talk about culture, identity, values? Is that something you'd be willing to discuss with me? I'd really like to be part of that conversation. And, if they were to say no, then okay, we put that on the shelf maybe for another day. But hopefully you get their assent and they're excited about it, because I find this is a really exciting area to discuss. Of course, letting them know they only need to share what they're comfortable sharing. And I know that seems really straightforward and basic, but it's surprising where I thought I had really good rapport with a client, and I did, but they still weren't yet at a place where they were willing to disclose certain parts of their identity with me until much later on. So I find that to be important. Just giving them an idea to conceptualize that these three domains are certainly separate, but they also are linked and overlap. And then I like to find a starting point, and I think this is important because every client's going to be different. So, I've worked kindergarten all the way up through high school, college, and adult. And based on people's experiences and where they've lived and what they've done, the background they come from, their education level, what have you, they're going to be at a very different place for this. So just asking them, putting your feelers out there and saying, hey, what do you know about culture? What do you know about your identities and your value system? And how do you feel about your culture, identity, and values? And kind of let that be your starting place. And again, it's going to be different for each client. So for me, this is super important. Culture humility. Of course, you recognize that's Owen et al. 2016. This jumped off the page for me during my grad program. I absolutely loved it. It resonated with who I am as a person and how I see things, my worldview. But I know you know this already probably. So a quick recap. What is it? It is respectfully and collaboratively exploring a client's culture with them, letting them be in the driver's seat, letting them teach you, which can be really exciting for them and to hear and to learn about their culture, making sure we stay open-minded to cultural differences. And why are we going to do it? We're going to go ahead and try to put our biases, our assumptions on the shelf, and we're going to keep that out of the counseling environment. And I think that's really important. We all try really hard to be unbiased, to not make assumptions, but we're human, we're imperfect, it happens. And it never ceases to amaze me when I have a general assumption about something. 9 times out of 10, I'm wrong. So I just continue to remind myself and reinforce, let's keep that out of the counseling session. And then making sure we have a safe space so the client feels that they can discuss these things with you. I think this is all very important. Okay, techniques. So this is identity. So I want to say, in jumping into this and then culture and values, that these activities I use with my clients and they work really well. They're on the end of the spectrum that are more simplistic, but I think that's important. I don't want to recreate the wheel, reinvent the wheel, or keep it. I want to keep it simple because what I find to be the more important part is not actually the activity, but the ensuing conversation during the activity and the one that comes afterward. Just like I said, wilderness therapy, adventure therapy is my background, which I hope to someday use it with military culture, which is really exciting to me. The activity is one thing, but it's the conversation that happens afterward where we process what went well, what didn't go well, what didn't we like, what are our takeaways, what did we learn? So this is essentially all these activities here are geared towards being a springboard for an important conversation and some self-discovery. So here I use this identity exploration wheel. You can just look around the edges. I think a lot of times our minds gravitate towards like race and ethnicity, and that's great. But also things here like national origin and first language. If you've lived in the same place your entire life and everybody speaks English and that's your worldview, that really doesn't maybe resonate with you. But if you've lived abroad or if you live in an area like Miami or Los Angeles, just for 2 examples, it could be a little bit different. So we're taking a look at these different domains of identity. And then here's just a few questions I like, of these identities, which ones you think about the most, which ones you think about the least, which ones are you curious about? I really like that question because sometimes I'm surprised by the answer. Something they kind of glossed over in answering that part of their identity, but then they might say, I really want to learn more about that or discuss that further. So then again, we let that guide the conversation. And how do these identities contribute to who you are as a person? Okay. So as you all already know, identity, there are many, I would say infinite domains Here's a list of just a few. Some of them were on the previous slide. Towards the bottom, I added a few. Socioeconomic class, obviously for today's presentation, military, civilian. What I find interesting is that if somebody's military, they're probably going to lead with that or very close to it. That's going to be most likely, here I am assuming again, but they're most likely going to lay that out as one of their primary domains of identity. Whereas somebody who's civilian probably will not refer to themselves as civilian. They probably won't even know what that means. When you're in an area that's military, you live close to a military base, people might identify as military versus civilian, but in everyday language, we don't really talk like that. And then education level, I think that's important to all of us here. And then, of course, are you a student? Or if not, what do you do for work? And how is that important to you?
What's nice here too, Ian, as you mentioned, getting or asking about military and civilian status, you really get a pulse on an individual's identity. So like the questions that you were asking before, what's the most important one? What's the least important one? What are you more curious about? Depending on, you could have a client in your counseling session, they could have just joined the military. And so maybe that identity isn't as established as someone who has retired military. That might be the first thing that they mention in terms of identity and that work that they're here to do to help establish a new identity as a civilian, having retired. So I like to mention that because in a lot of the work that I've done with military, it's always interesting to ask some of those identity questions, because when you fill out those they fill out the application to see you, you do some of the background work in your intake. As Ian was saying before, it's easy to assume that the military is going to be this huge part of one's life and one's identity. But doing work here in getting to know their identity a little bit more, you get, like I said earlier, a pulse of how much these pieces are and the identity that they want to share.
Yeah, certainly. And, military, their identity obviously they're probably going to lead with, this is my branch, this is my, MOS, or this is my job, or, active duty versus retired, enlisted officer. Those things are all going to be really important, as you all already know, I'm sure. And we want to make sure we try to get that language right. It's very important. Okay, so here's one that I really like. So this identity card sort, I am obsessed with this card sort. I've done this for culture, values, identity, and for also just, what's bothering us or things that are geared towards treatment plan. But I really like it. It's simple, it's really effective, and it's shocking how much can be revealed in this very simple activity. So based on, the values, the domains of identity that your client just laid out, say, okay, let's go ahead and have a little fun. And all these activities here are geared towards having a little bit of fun. I like to keep the client involved. I like them to be an active participant. Anytime I can get them to physically engage, I think that's really great. And getting them to take part and move around a bit, I just think it really brings the whole thing to life. And yeah, it can be really revealing. So I'll have them go ahead. I always keep note cards on me, blank note cards. And I have them just write out, the different domains of identity. And then very simply, let's go ahead and place these in order from most important to least important. And here where I think I know how they're going to lay it out, typically I'm wrong. So if somebody's military status, again, most likely it's going to be in your top 1, 2, or 3 cards. So if you haven't figured it out, I did this one the other day. So this is me. But for me, my job and my schooling and being healthy and fit, and these things are more important to me than anything else. Whereas I put civilian because that's me. And that's all the way at the end. I'm non-military, so I don't think about this on a day-to-day. I just happen to have a huge interest in military. I study it and I like to work with those populations, which is why I even know what that term means in the first place. But this can be very revealing. So then after they identify their top 3, we're going to go ahead and say, okay, why are these the most important to you? What do these mean to you? And we can go ahead and maybe allow the client to discard some of the bottom 2/3 and really focus on these. And then how can we link these to the treatment plan, the goals, maybe what's bothering them? Again, a springboard for a conversation. culture, my favorite. So here's just a general definition from American Psychological Association. I like this icon, so I threw it in here. I think this is how I see it. I think a lot of times in our country, when we talk about culture, our brains often go to maybe our heritage or our race or ethnicity, but there's so many other parts of culture. And I just want to make sure that we touch on all those with the client and explore those. So I thought this icon did a pretty good job here, laying some of those out. And something about culture I want to share with you all. I had the opportunity during this graduate degree to live abroad. I ended up living in Mexico for 2 years and studying and completing work online. And this to me was an amazing opportunity to study another culture, to immerse myself, to study culture and language. And I'll never forget this moment where I was in my multicultural course and it was like our first week or whatever in a Zoom class. And the professor said, I'd like you to all take turns and unmute and tell us about your culture. And I sat there patiently waiting and nobody was willing to speak up. It really put us all on the spot. And this was fascinating to me because we're people that are in their late 20s, mid 30s, early 40s, and nobody felt confident to say, this is my culture, this is who I am. I was really shocked at that. So I was able actually to unmute. And the only reason I was able to talk confidently and in detail about my culture was because of the contrast. I was living in another country. I didn't really know what my culture was until living abroad in another culture. And through those contrasting experiences and those dramatic differences, it kind of highlighted for me what my personal culture was. So I think this is maybe, it feels basic and obvious, but it's not. And we were all educated and still we struggled with that question. So again, this one's pretty basic, but I'm gonna go ahead and ask my client, what do you know about culture? What does culture mean to you? And then based off that starting point, if needed, I'll go ahead and share a broad definition of culture. And then again, maybe encourage them to talk a little more about their culture. They could give you a narrative, they can give you a story, they can just tell you some details. However they wanna go about it. There are no wrong answers to culture. So for me, I come from a culture where being on time is really important, as you all know, punctuality. But living in Central America, if you're on time, people laugh at you. I would show up for a class and I'd be 10 minutes early and I thought, oh, the class must be canceled. Nobody showed up until 5 minutes after the class started. So I was like, okay, my culture is punctuality and being on time. Again, nothing to do with my heritage or my race. So there's no wrong answers. Remind the client that culture goes way beyond ethnicity, heritage, for example, education, discipline, family holidays. I joke that I come from a coffee culture. In the US, we certainly have a coffee culture that doesn't exist everywhere, but as you all know, that's something here typical to the US. So just allowing them to explore that and being there to support it and have that conversation. So here's something I like to use. It's a collage, like I said, pretty basic, but this one works really well for homework. If you don't have time to do this in session, this can be one that you could send home with your client to do and bring back to you. When we think of collage, I think back to middle school where you cut out pictures from newspapers and magazines and put them on a poster board. You could do that. This is a little more simple, just having them use different colored markers, pencils, crayons, and they could draw their culture or they could write out different terms, labels within the domains of culture, but ask them to write out different parts of their culture that are important to them. Tell them to have fun with it, make it fun. If you do it in session, have a conversation, let them have some fun, let them choose colored poster board or construction paper, markers, pencils, crayons. I always give my clients the option. And then again, it's the questions and it's the conversation. So where do these elements of your culture come from? Some of these questions I find are interesting because the reaction I get is sometimes a client says, nobody's ever asked me that before. I've never thought of that before. I've talked about conceptualizing your culture on finance and money, and a client tell me everything they know about money. I say, where did you get all the information from? And they're like, I have no idea. Like, I don't even know everything there is about their financial culture. they don't know where necessarily they got it from. And then usually they trace it back to their parents and how their parents taught them to conceptualize. Okay. But anyway, there's a few more. How do these affect your life? And individual versus family culture. I think that's really important as well. I see we're quickly running out of time. That snuck up quick. Values. Another one I like to do with clients is have them do a body map. You know, you can draw a quick blocky body or let them do it, pencils, crayons, markers. But we're going to look at values. If your client is unaware of what their values are, what their value options could be, you can certainly pull one off, you know, Google image or whatever, a list of values, there's icons, there's lists, and have them pick out their top ones and draw them into this body map. I tell them they can put them strategically, like locate them. This one here was fun, kind of like a starburst out of the chest, respect and honesty, discipline and authenticity. But we're going to go ahead and allow them to explore that, have a little fun, be creative. And then it's that important conversation. Why are these so important to you? What do they mean to you? How did you acquire these? How do our values change over time? And, you know, what does this say about you as a person? And again, if your client's military, a lot of this is going to tie back to their military culture, and potentially some of the conflicts they're experiencing come from that military culture. Maybe they're transitioning from military back into the civilian world, and the values that were important in the military are looked down upon, or there's a lot of friction in the civilian culture based on those values. And then just some follow-up questions here you can always ask. You know, what are the most important lessons you learned from mom, dad, parent, guardian, whoever raised you? What has life taught you? And what are your best qualities? What do you do just for yourself? And I like to know what motivates my client towards success. And these can be extremely revealing as we tie them back to personal values. And if your client doesn't have a strong sense of personal values, it could be a good opportunity to start building what they can identify as their core value system. Okay, that brings us to the end. So we only have a few minutes left, but if y'all have any questions, comments, we'd love to hear from you. You can write in the chat box or just unmute.
So far, there has been no questions in the chat box so far, so everybody's just free to write it now.
Great, thank you. And other things, when we think back at our framework, so the individual level, so we talked a little bit about gender. So that's something that I know in my work with the military, if you're working with service members who are women, that individual piece. So when we're looking at them being in a pretty masculine culture, that piece could be a piece of conflict of like, I don't feel like I'm seen as a woman. I'm very proud of being a woman. I'm very proud of how I've made it to the top or whatever rank that they've made it to. And yet I'm just trying to mask myself in a lot of ways to be a man because I have to have this strength and these different abilities. And so that's another, when we're just thinking of those various levels in that framework, any level we can see conflict, and it could really depend on if that individual is in that active duty status or kind of transitioning or has transitioned to veteran status. Anthony, I see your hand is raised. Please ask a question or your comment.
Well, I actually have two parts there.
Sure.
First of all, your team did a very, very good job of presenting information. I even learned a lot of things I didn't even know. I am retired Army. I put in there initially, you asked the question, why are people here? This is one of the populations that I'm entertaining going into after I complete my degree. The big thing is when it comes to the military, it would actually be very hard for me to speak with a counselor that's non-military or is not a military family member, and that's male or female, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to reach that audience that may be like me, that irrelevant to how good the person may be, I would have a bias against them. I just wanted to share that.
Thanks, Anthony. That's actually pretty common in what we hear. And there is some research that, well, because of that statement, there's some counselors out in the field too that feel similar. How can I be a competent counselor? How can I have a passion for working with the military, but I'm not connected. I've never served. Can I work with this group? Can I be effective? And so, yes, the answer is yes, you can work with that group. And yes, you can be effective. You need to know, you have to have your knowledge, your skills, your cultural competency. But it does depend on the client that you're serving and what they're looking for in terms of counselor client fit. So that is an important comment as well. I was a military spouse. My experience in the military was not that I had served like my spouse. So clients coming to me for some, being a spouse was enough because I was sort of connected more personally to the culture, but for others it was no, I want to talk to someone who has served. Also thinking too about some of the issues as counselors that we can face. So if we have had that experience, you know, the transference versus counter-transference issues that can occur more likely depending on your experience and the experience that your client is sharing. So in some cases, it may be better to be partnered with someone who has never served, just to kind of play devil's advocacy and really think about all perspectives and world views. Carrie, I see you also have your hand up.
There we go. I couldn't find the button. I switched over to my phone. I'm not used to using Zoom from my phone. Kind of to piggyback off of what Anthony said, and I think that's part of where I'm coming from, wanting to work with the military community. For me, having been a female veteran or a female active duty who survived sexual assault during that time, the majority of providers in the military setting and a lot in the VA, now the VA is at least aware that it's an issue, but the response is not quite up to snuff. And one of the most impactful things for me was being able to be a part of a women's trauma group. And there was like one total at that time. And it may have become slightly more commonplace now, but being able to be with a group of women that had experienced the same thing. So kind of that understanding that, hey, I'm not alone in this. And I think that kind of ties in with what Anthony was saying. Well, for me, I am kind of okay going to a provider that may not be military. It's a little more difficult to provide them that context of, hey, this is where I'm coming from. But I feel it's at least easier if you have somebody that's very much aware of how the military handles things like sexual assault. I know I was in one of the other groups earlier, and we talked about like how the providers kind of struggle to switch from hat to hat, from being the provider to also being a service member. And some of the things that are very common for sexual assault survivors is they'll get slapped with a diagnosis of BPD and get processed out within 6 or 7 months. Like, that is the overwhelming majority. And then those same people end up without their benefits because it was a pre-existing condition. They end up without resources for mental health, without jobs, living on the street. They're more likely to end up with substance use issues. In fact, female veterans with MST are the fastest growing homeless population in the United States. So I think kind of having that awareness and knowing that there is a really huge problem in that area is definitely lacking. And it's maybe not across the board, but a lot of times you talk to people and they're like, what? No, that's clearly not how that's supposed to work. And it's like, but that is how it works, which is why the veteran community, we have like this mental block about going to see healthcare providers, because we have this fear, oh, they're going to stick us with the diagnosis we can't get rid of, even if it's inaccurate, and it's going to be very retaliatory. I know even like just mental health as a whole, in boot camp, one of the first things I distinctly remember was them saying, and I'll try to paraphrase and cut out some of the language, but if you ever think of committing suicide, keep that to yourself. Otherwise, you're going to be on a plane home, you know? And then you get out into the fleet or wherever, and they're like, well, if you need to go to mental health, and of course, everybody's going to be like, no, I'm not going. Like, and that carries through. So that's definitely something that, you talked about it a little bit on, you know, with the whole that it's viewed as weakness, but it's not just weakness. Like, they're being kind of scared into not necessarily just because it's weakness, but because something bad's going to happen. They're going to lose everything they've worked for. So,
yeah. Well, first of all, Carrie, thank you for sharing your experience and being so open and honest about it. I think that's a lot of the benefit, and what some of the techniques that we've proposed. You're really opening those conversations. You're allowing the conversation to occur, your experience, your values, and you're right. And you were able to speak to some of those conflicts that you see with mental. We talked about it perfectly before, you know, mental health versus that warrior training mentality. So I am aware that we are at time. We would be happy to send we have our contact information on the next slide that I'll just flash. Feel free to contact any one of us if you want to continue the conversation. We would be happy to provide our slides to anyone that wants it as well. And we just thank you so much for being part of this conversation, joining us today, and really thinking about how we can do better as clinical, or at least us, clinical mental health counselors servicing the military. So thank you, thank you. We are so happy to have been part of this conference.